This is going to be the only video you'll need to see on Ralf Rangnick, the godfather of the gegenpress and the new interim manager at Manchester United until the end of the season. I'm going to be covering the history of Rangnick and his managerial rise. I'll explain his tactics. We'll be looking at the likely starting 11 that he'll be using at United. We'll have a look at what impact Rangnick might have on Manchester United and also why I'm surprised by this appointment. Rangnick's playing career, we'll start with that, was incredibly uneventful, pretty much, no offence to him. But even as a player, Rangnick was developing as a coach and a tactician. In fact, during a sports science lecture, Rangnick was amazed to hear that someone else in another field, a woman in the professional volleyball team, would train up to 10 hours a day. He was incredibly shocked at that because at that point in Germany, footballers were only training around 2 hours a day. So armed with the knowledge that other athletes could be training up to 5 times as much as footballers, Rangnick therefore concluded there was a higher level of performance that could be achieved with increased training time. Literally, you could do an extra 5 times as much compared to the other sports at the time. At the age of 25 in 1983, Rangnick would become player manager of local club Viktoria Backnang, which was a 6th tier side in Germany at the time, and it was here where his tactical evolution would flourish, ultimately leading to the creation of gegenpressing, or counter-pressing as it's known in English, and this is the tactical style most closely associated with Jurgen Klopp's Liverpool. The way it was developed by Rangnick was in a friendly match against Dynamo Kiev, in which Rangnick played the match in the defensive midfield position, and he experienced firsthand Kiev's pressing system and zonal marking, and he felt that Kiev always had 1 or 2 more men on the pitch than him because he was continually being bombarded by waves and waves of pressing opponents. And Rangnick was so in awe of the style of play, coached by the legendary Ukrainian manager Valery Lobanovsky, that he would attend every Kiev training session thereafter as much as he could to try to learn from Kiev as much as he could to try to figure out what they were doing so he could implement this style himself. And one of the main reasons why he did that was because he wasn't getting a proper coaching education in Germany. German coaching in football was stuck in the past, and Rangnick would later state that Kiev was the first team he'd ever come up against who systemically pressed the ball, and that was his football epiphany. He understood that there was a different way of playing, this gegenpress way of playing. And then another influence for Rangnick was Arrigo Sacchi, not just in terms of tactics, but also in respect of his coaching rise, because Sacchi was a shoe salesman. He was a former shoe salesman, never played football professionally. And in the 80s especially, it was incredibly unusual for someone who wasn't a former star player to be given a role at a big club, especially in Germany. But Sacchi was the perfect role model for Rangnick because Sacchi was the legendary manager of AC Milan in the 80s and 90s, and he would actually win back-to-back European Cups with AC Milan. So he was a huge role model for Rangnick, not only tactically, but also in terms of his coaching rise. And that combination of Sacchi's tactics at AC Milan, the space and ball-orientated defending, and Lobanovsky's pressing tactics at Dynamo Kiev coupled together, would give birth to Rangnick's gegen-pressing system, which we all know so well, mainly thanks to Jurgen Klopp, I think, in this country. Anyway, as soon as possession is lost, the team aggressively presses the opposition to regain possession and take advantage whilst the opposition are in defensive transition. So basically, whilst they're as disorganised as possible. In terms of the history of Rangnick, just going back to that, Rangnick worked his way up the ranks of German football throughout the 80s and 90s, primarily with youth and lower division sides, because none of the German clubs wanted to take a risk on this unknown person, pretty much, who wasn't a former star player. But it was at Ulm 1846 where Rangnick would be properly noticed for the first time. He joined them in 1997 and he won promotion to the 2nd tier of German football the year after. Ulm would actually go on to achieve promotion to the Bundesliga for the first time in their history 3 years after Rangnick joined the club. So just to demonstrate the sort of effect Rangnick has on clubs, he comes in, they're quite low down in the divisions, whatever, and he's able to build them back up due to his excellent coaching. And those efforts didn't go unnoticed, thankfully. He was invited to the German equivalent of Match of the Day to explain how his side, with very little financial strength, because Ulm weren't financially backed at all really, how they were able to compete for the promotion spaces. But other coaches felt insulted at the implication that their methods were outdated, and Rangnick was mocked and described as the professor, because it's apparently a bad thing to be a professor, but it was more of a mocking term. It would later go on to be a positive term for Rangnick, but at the time, at least, it was done in a mocking way. Because even though Rangnick was absolutely right, the prevailing sentiment in German football at the time, as I've mentioned, was the use of a sweeper and Rangnick's revolutionary flat-back four just basically almost insulted these coaches who were of the mindset of, well, it's a sweeper system and man marking has worked in Germany for however many decades. Why fix what isn't broken? Let's just keep doing what we're doing. But Rangnick wanted to revolutionise, and they weren't happy with that pretty much, and they felt insulted basically. But after Ulm came Rangnick's first chance at a big German club in Stuttgart. They appointed him as the head coach in 1999. Rangnick wouldn't have the best time at Stuttgart, being sacked by the club after 2 years of the club dangerously close to the relegation places. However, there were mitigating circumstances. This wasn't a huge failure by Rangnick by any means, and this is actually something that is pertinent to Manchester United that we will be discussing in more detail later. But the key reason why Rangnick failed at Stuttgart was due to a clash of cultures between him and the higher-ups, the club hierarchy, the people who are in charge of the structural decisions, because he was hired to revolutionise and change the structure of Stuttgart. But then as soon as those changes threatened the existing order and status quo of the people who were in jobs, the main reason why they were in those jobs, just by virtue of them being there for a long time, rather than them being the best person for the job, those people, their existence was threatened by Rangnick, who wanted to come in, tear everything up, improve everything, look to get, new blood in, get the right people for the right job in. Their existence was threatened by Rangnick. So the club panicked and they didn't follow through with any of the key changes Rangnick wanted to implement. So there are some mitigating circumstances there as to why it didn't work. However, it does become a bit of a common theme, Rangnick disagreeing with the club's higher-ups. He went down the divisions in Germany, went to the second tier with Hannover 96 after Stuttgart, and once again achieved promotion to the Bundesliga in 2002 in his first season. But it was a similar situation to Stuttgart, as I've mentioned. There was a disagreement between Rangnick and the Hannover higher-ups, and Rangnick was sacked in 2004, a couple of seasons after he took the job. Then the following season, Rangnick would get a role at the highest status club he'd been at in his career at that point. He was hired by Schalke. He finished as runner-up to Bayern Munich in both the league and the DFB Pokal, which is the German equivalent of the FA Cup. And again, there was a clash between Rangnick and the club's hierarchies. In fact, the owner of Schalke would actually mock Rangnick, and they'd mock his obsession with paying attention to every single minute detail and his inability to delegate. It doesn't really make sense, because why, you know exactly what sort of person he is. Why would you bring him in just to mock him? But then Hoffenheim, this is where it gets very interesting. Hoffenheim would follow Schalke. In 2021, Hoffenheim, in the modern day, Hoffenheim is an established Bundesliga side. They've produced the likes of Roberto Firmino, for example. They've taken part in the Champions League, famously managed by Julian Nagelsmann a few years ago. I think we all know about Hoffenheim. But when Rangnick joined the club in 2006, Hoffenheim were in the third tier of German football. Hoffenheim, I didn't know this, Hoffenheim is a very tiny village in Germany. The population of Hoffenheim is only just over 3,000. They are literally a small village club. But Rangnick was tasked with getting this small village club in the third tier of German football into the Bundesliga. In fairness, it was and is owned by billionaire Dietmar Hopp, so he was financially backed. Hopp's ambition was to see Hoffenheim in the Bundesliga, and he hired Rangnick to do that. And up until now, Hopp's invested around 350 million euros into the club, and with that backing, Rangnick was able to transform Hoffenheim from a third division side into a Bundesliga side, and this is where Rangnick truly made a name for himself. His Hoffenheim played high tempo, vertical, pressing football, a style of play that had never been seen in the Bundesliga at that point, and this is where the likes of Luis Gustavo and Demba Ba established themselves as top players, and this is where gegenpressing truly announced itself to the world. And perhaps the greatest impact of Rangnick's Hoffenheim was the effect it had on then Dortmund manager Jurgen Klopp. This is exactly the style of football I want to play with Dortmund in the future, is what Klopp told Rangnick. And then over the next 2 to 3 years, Klopp was able to develop and implement that gegenpressing style into his Dortmund side. That would see them win consecutive Bundesliga titles, DFB Pokal trophies, and also feature in the Champions League final, where they would finish as runners-up to Bayern Munich. Rangnick would also revolutionise the game off the pitch. Rangnick created roles which are commonplace now in modern football, but they were unheard of at the time. Rangnick's training sessions were infamously so intense that when it came to an actual match, it was much more comfortable for the players because they'd already experienced something much harder in the training session before. But ultimately, Rangnick would leave Hoffenheim for the exact reason he was sacked by Stuttgart, Hannover and Schalke earlier in his career. There were disagreement with higher-ups. Hoffenheim's owner, after significant investment into the club, getting them established into the Bundesliga in mid-table, he was very happy with those mid-table finishes, and he basically wanted to consolidate Hoffenheim's status in the league rather than take the next step and push for consistent European places or Bundesliga title challenges. So he sold Luis Gustavo to Bayern Munich for around 20 million euros, I think, without Rangnick's approval or knowledge. And that's a big no-no for Rangnick, because he wants to be involved, especially at that point in his career, wants to be involved in every single element, every single decision-making element of the club. And that was enough for Rangnick to resign. Rangnick wanted to push on, not consolidate, and the selling of one of his favourite players to a rival as well, strengthening a rival, classic Bayern Munich. Selling of his favourite player without a say, that was the final straw for Rangnick. Following season, there'd be a second spell at Schalke in 2011, despite the issues they'd had at Schalke before. They brought him on again, and that would actually produce Rangnick's brightest and darkest hours in football, because he won his first major trophy in the DFB Pokal with Schalke, and he also guided Schalke to the semi-finals of the Champions League. They knocked out the defending champions Inter Milan in the quarter-finals, but then they would fall short in the semi-finals, but it was against a Manchester United side, which was probably Manchester United's last truly great side. So not too bad to go out to them, reaching the semi-finals with Schalke, a huge achievement. But at this stage in his career, Rangnick was clinically exhausted, and he opted to take a break from management. He was burnt out, which isn't a surprise given how invested Rangnick becomes, not only in respect of the playing squad, but all aspects of the running of the club. Rangnick became director of football at RB Leipzig and Salzburg in 2012, and he was essentially tasked with what he achieved at Hoffenheim, but on a much grander scale. He wasn't done as a coach yet, however, as when Leipzig needed a coach in 2015, he simply appointed himself because he thought he was the best person for the job, and won promotion to the Bundesliga the same season. He then stepped aside, but came back to manage Leipzig one more time before the club was able to secure Nagelsmann in 2018, because again, he thought, instead of just getting some interim who wouldn't be the best person for the job, I can just do it for a year. And that season, Leipzig would reach the final of the DFB Pokal and also finish third in the Bundesliga. Rangnick essentially birthed what we know as RB Leipzig today, on and off the pitch. Took them from the fourth tier to the Bundesliga in an incredibly short period of time. Leipzig was an amalgamation of Rangnick's tactical style and structural club setup off and on the pitch. He focused on youth development and was able to fully utilise the financial backing of the Red Bull Empire, and demonstrated his footballing intelligence as to club structure and how to structure a club. And also the transfer strategy at RB Leipzig and RB Salzburg was exceptional. When Rangnick went into those clubs, the average ages of the squad was around 30. That's not the sort of play Rangnick wants. He wants youthful players because they have more energy. Older players, as he says, are slower in body, slower in mind. And also the sales from these teams were very low. They weren't getting much resale value from the players they signed, because they were just purchasing older players, weren't actually making any profits on them because they couldn't. So it's just staggering to think that not only did that all change when Rangnick came in, but the degree to which it changed was also exceptional. The scouting, the development of the players was a key priority for Rangnick to earn the club's huge money from the resales. I'm just going to list some names now: Erling Haaland, Naby Keita, Sadio Mane. That's just a few of the names. The list goes on and on. It was an unprecedented turnaround and just demonstrates Rangnick's intelligence at the highest levels of football governance, basically. And then after his success with Leipzig, Rangnick took a role as head of sports and development at Lokomotiv Moscow, and now he's the interim manager at Manchester United for 6 months. So that's the history of Rangnick. Hope you're still with me. Now let's take a closer look at Rangnick's tactics and what starting 11 I think he'd go for at United. His style of play heavily influenced Klopp, Tuchel, Hasenhüttl, Nagelsmann, because as we discussed, Rangnick is essentially the creator of gegenpressing, and they all see Rangnick as their mentor. If you look at any top German coach right now in modern football, they'll have either worked alongside or been inspired by Rangnick. He's essentially the father, the godfather, whatever you want to call him, of coaching in Germany. And without him, German football wouldn't be what it is today. We've discussed United's tactical failings previously on this channel, but Rangnick will be looking to transform United into an organised side playing exciting, high-energy football. He said that the job of a coach is to have a clear idea of how the team should play. The best managers know exactly what their football looks like, and their job is to transform that into the DNA of the players, so it's second nature to the players. It's all about how good the manager is at conveying their philosophy and thought process to the players. And that's exactly what United need. I think they need a clear and defined style of play. At United, there have always been question marks about United's tactics and strategy under Ollie, and that was most noticeable against Liverpool. The team was sort of half-arsed in their pressing. They didn't know whether to fully commit or not because they weren't being coached properly. They didn't know what to do. So they were caught in the middle ground of only pressing a bit. And as Rangnick has said, a little bit of pressing is like being a little bit of pregnant. You either are or you aren't. In a similar thing to Yoda, do or do not, there is no try. But under Rangnick, it will be very obvious what United try and do on the pitch. Rangnick's even said, even on a bad day, you should still be able to recognise the football we play. And he's absolutely right, because what comes first is the style of play. That weeds out players who aren't good enough to play that style of football in the first instance, so you know who you need to move on, who you need to replace. And it also means that once the current manager is gone, because Rangnick's only going to be there for 6 months, but this doesn't just apply to Rangnick, it applies to other teams as well, you know exactly what kind of manager needs to be brought in. Because rather than bringing in a totally different manager who plays a completely different style, as United have been doing since Fergie, Moyes, totally different to Van Gaal, who's totally different to Mourinho, who's totally different to Ollie in terms of their tactics. You've got conformity and uniformity. So it means you don't have to build a team around the manager. The manager comes in and the structure, the tactics, the formation, etc. is already in place. And this is how Rangnick has described his style of play. Gegenpressing is a very proactive style of football, similar to the way in which Dortmund and Liverpool have been playing under Klopp. We like to press high with a very intense counter pressure. When we have the ball, we do not like any square or back passes. It is a fast, proactive, attacking, counter-attacking, counter-pressing, exciting and entertaining style of football. As we've already discussed, this is the football he most notably played at Hoffenheim and RB Leipzig. At Hoffenheim, Rangnick mainly used a 4-3-3, and at Leipzig, whilst he used a number of formations, the most common were the 4-4-2 or a 4-4-2 that would turn into a 4-2-2-2, sometimes a 4-4-2 diamond, but more often than not, it was this 4-2-2-2. As is the case with gegenpressing, when out of possession, his teams press as soon as possible to win the ball as high up the pitch as possible, because the closer you are to your opponent's goal when you win the ball, the more likely you are to create a goal-scoring action. Just makes sense. It will also give the opposition less time to properly transition into a defensive shape, meaning they are disorganised and at the most vulnerable in that situation. And this pressing preferably involves a numerical advantage of at least 1, so that the player in possession is denied access to the passing lanes they want to play the ball to. The team knows when to press because they're coached to understand pressing triggers. For example, a team with 2 centre-halves may contain a player who is less competent on the ball than the other, so the pressing team will know that as soon as that player receives the ball, that is when the press should be triggered, that's when it should begin. And one of Rangnick's most notable pressing triggers was a centre-half playing a square ball to the other centre-half. The player receiving the ball is pressed by the winger, shutting off the passing lane, forcing the ball to be played back to the other centre-half. The winger then gets tight and cuts off the passing lane to the fullback, meaning the player on the ball now has to either play the ball all the way back to the keeper or take the risk of playing a forward ball to a player that's liable to be dispossessed by a nearby presser. And pressing traps are also part of Rangnick's game, whereby a player is allowed the illusion of a degree of space and time, but the team all understand that they're purposefully giving them this time on the ball. The team all understand that as soon as the ball is played to that player, the trap has been activated and the numerical superiority pressing can commence. At Hoffenheim, it was a mid-block press, and at Leipzig, it was a high press, but both systems were devastating on the counter-attack regardless of whether they were pressing in the middle of the pitch or high up the pitch. The key element was what Rangnick's side did as soon as they won back possession of the ball. The objective was to create a chance as quickly as possible, and that meant the emphasis was on quick, vertical passing, as sideways passing, square passing. Rangnick hates that, essentially. It's obviously not as efficient as playing the ball forwards. It's not as dynamic as playing it forwards if you can. To create a chance within 10 seconds was what Rangnick aimed for, and that's reflected in the fact that under Rangnick's Leipzig, around 60% of the goals scored at Leipzig were scored within 10 seconds of regaining possession, which is a quite mad stat to think about, but that's how essential gegenpressing was. And it was also a similar theme when Rangnick's sides were forced into defensive transition. He wanted the ball to be won back even quicker than that, closer to 6 to 8 seconds. And if United can pull that off, if they can pull it off, then defending would essentially become United's best form of attack. Rangnick's side out of possession would also shift across to one end of the pitch to cut off any passing lanes for the opposition. And whilst in theory that could create a huge space on the opposite end of the pitch for the opposition team to exploit, the intensity of the pressing meant that that was rarely an issue. So United have 2 issues, it seems, in terms of formation, if we're basing off Rangnick's past teams. Hoffenheim played the 4-3-3, Leipzig primarily a 4-4-2/4-2-2, and because he had more success at Leipzig, I think that he will be playing a 4-2-2 at United, and do also think that the 4-2-2 suits United's squad and team under Rangnick more so than the 4-3-3. So we'll go with the 4-2-2. And in this formation, Rangnick's wide players would actually tuck inside behind the strike partnership, and they'd actually act as playmakers rather than traditional wingers. And you may be thinking, well, that formation looks a bit too narrow. And you might be right, but that is one of the key facets of Rangnick's side, because by playing a narrow formation, it forces the opposition to also play narrow to match them up to try to deny passing lanes. But that in turn provides Rangnick's side with space out wide for the fullbacks, who are now unmarked essentially, because they're forcing the opposition side to play so narrow. So it means they can now utilise the width in those moments. So this would be my starting 11 under Rangnick, bearing in mind everything we've just discussed, the key tenets of his game, what makes the most sense for his gegenpressing system. The keeper is the keeper, the back four is the back four. Where it gets interesting, I think, is in the midfield and then the attack. We all know the issues about Manchester United's midfield, the fact that there is no pure defensive midfielder at that club other than Matic, who is about 87 years old and as immobile as a broken yacht. But I do think that a pairing of Fred and Van der Beek would work quite well in this system. Yes, we are restoring Van der Beek to an actual player. What? There's no McTominay here. I don't think Matic is a viable option, as I just mentioned. McTominay is not currently tactically intelligent enough to play this system, and he's just not that good. He's just not that good. He's not a defensive midfielder anyway, so no, McTominay can play on the bench. He can be a fine squad player, whatever. Pogba, is dumb. I think Pogba's done now. Maybe I'm wrong, but I can't see him fitting in at all unless Pogba significantly changes his game. And first of all, I can't see that because he doesn't strike me as the sort of person who would be willing to change his game to that degree, to play this system, to be incredibly intense in the press, because that would arguably be the most important position in Rangnick's 4-2-2, that central midfield area. But also, he's in the final year of his contract, so even if he was willing to change, adapt, and play Rangnick's style of play, he's only here for a year anyway. I think that Pogba would just be a waste, essentially. I think this just I mean, the writing was been on the wall for a while. This appointment, I think, just confirms that Pogba's United career is done unless something drastic changes, basically. Sancho flourishes under Rangnick 100%. He's a very creative winger, so I think he'd suit the sort of winger slash playmaker role really well. And then we'd have Fernandes on the other side. Is it his ideal role? No. But number 10 isn't going to work in any of Rangnick's systems. I do think Fernandes will be able to cope with the pressing game quite well. I do think that he would be perfect for Rangnick. He is definitely a player, unlike Pogba, who would be willing to press, and he is willing to press and give his all for the team. So I do think that Fernandes would flourish in this system, despite it not being entirely built around him as the 4-2-3-1 is. Up front is the most problematic area for United, I think, because of the options United have there. The most Rangnick forward United have is Cavani. Everyone knows about how good Cavani is defensively, how good his pressing game is. So in an ideal world, I'd start him. By contrast, Ronaldo is probably the most un-Rangnick forward United have. Again, everyone knows the situation with Ronaldo's pressing isn't really a thing. So the question becomes, do you hope that the rest of the team makes up for Ronaldo's lack of pressing? Or do you drop Ronaldo and put in someone who's more willing and or more capable at pressuring and pressing the ball, whether that's Greenwood or Rashford? I'd personally be tempted to play Cavani and Greenwood long term, but I do understand it's basically not possible to drop Ronaldo because he is Ronaldo. There's some political stuff going on there, I'm sure, because it is Ronaldo. So maybe that can be circumvented by playing a mid-press instead of the high press, as he did at Hoffenheim rather than Leipzig. But the high press is Rangnick's preferred style of play, and either way, it's not ideal to have a 36 Ronaldo in any system which relies on pressing. If I was going to be brave, and I think that Rangnick is very brave, and he would not worry about individuals over the team dynamic, I think he would try in the first instance to make Ronaldo work, whether that's the rest of the team pressing like mad to compensate for that. So he would give it a go, but if it wasn't up to his standard, I do think that Rangnick wouldn't hesitate in dropping him, and he would just play Cavani and Rashford or Cavani and Greenwood and drop Ronaldo, maybe bringing him on as an impact sort of player. Ronaldo just doesn't fit at all, but he's there, so it's a thing. So ultimately, it will boil down to whether United can significantly improve their play in transition, both offensively and defensively. As we saw against Liverpool, the team is currently shambolic when it comes to attempting a high press. But Rangnick would introduce an elite level of coaching to make it work long term. As Rangnick has said previously about Liverpool's forwards, who all press very well, when they first went to Liverpool, they weren't regarded as pressing machines at all. But thanks to Klopp's coaching, they are now. And that means that with the right coaching, United could achieve something similar. And Rangnick definitely could be the man for that job. Let's end on the impact Rangnick could have at United. He's going to be the manager until the end of the season, and that'll be followed by a 2-year consultancy role. When this appointment was announced, I was really surprised by it, to be honest. Partly because it's a good, interesting signing by United, and they haven't been associated with sensible business over the past few years, but mainly because based on the historical precedent, Rangnick is a bit of a control freak. He's mellowed out a bit in recent years, but history shows us that he is. He wants to be in charge of basically everything. And I am a bit amazed that he'd want to go into a club which is notorious for its lack of footballing intelligence and structure. So I'm assuming there's been some agreement whereby the club have agreed to allow Rangnick a certain degree of say and influence. Otherwise, I would be amazed as to why Rangnick would go to the club. But it's also interesting because Rangnick has a history of upsetting the higher-ups of clubs that are not willing to change or improve. Man United over the years have been the exact opposite of a Rangnick-structured club. So it could work either way. He could come in for those 2 years, totally transform the structure of the club for the better, if the current ownership and power structure allows him to do so, or United will realise they've bitten off more than they wanted to chew and won't be able to fulfil Rangnick's potential. So if there is a failing, I don't think it would be because of Rangnick, it'll be because of the Glazers, Woodward, etc. It'll be the higher-ups not allowing Rangnick to fulfil the club's potential under him. In terms of Rangnick's impact on the football structure of Man United, it should propel United back towards being an elite club, structurally and on the pitch. Transfer strategy, working with coaches, academy improvements, this is what Rangnick is an expert at. In addition to being a master tactician, those 2 years as a consultant could be priceless for United. It is exactly what they need, but as I say, that's totally reliant on whether the current ownership structure is willing to listen to Rangnick's critiques and whether they are willing to change. So that's Ralf Rangnick, the godfather of the gegenpress, the idol and inspiration to world-class managers including Klopp, Nagelsmann, Tuchel, a tactical genius on the pitch and an innovator off it, a man known for significantly improving teams and leaving them in a much better state than when he found them. It's a very good and very interesting appointment by Man United. I think his work as a consultant will actually prove to be of greater benefit to United than his interim coaching role, but his 6 months as a coach should set the squad up nicely for someone like Pochettino to take over and further the development of that squad. That's Ralf Rangnick. Let me know what your thoughts are on him in the comment section. Are you happy with the appointment? Are you scared of the appointment? Make sure to leave a like on the video if you like the video, subscribe if you are new, and I'll see you guys next time.